So, after a very good while, we come back on the Kingdom of Sicily, and more precisely, we're gonna give a look to the evolution of statal structures within this kingdom in the passage between, the Normans, the Swabians, and especially the Angevins, in which we will concentrate. Why statal structures? Well, if any of you doesn't know about it, the Norman Kingdom of Sicily, similarly to the Norman Kingdom of England, but even more intensely, was in the context of feudal Europe the most centralized kingdom in Europe at the time. And it's very important to stress this particular characteristics of the Sicilian kingdom because it is something that actually was carried out in a form that is unknown even to essentially the Kingdom of England. Kingdom of England at a certain point suffers some crisis. We have the Magna Carta that basically enhances this idea that the local barons had more prerogatives than even more than the same king, and that the king had to obey to the common law and the baronal prerogatives. However, the Sicilian kingdom took completely another path. First of all, it was born already more centralized than the Kingdom of England. If anything, for a reason that is that it was a much more solid one, and also a much wealthier one, to be honest. If you see the two Norman kingdoms in comparison, the Kingdom of Sicily was definitely a much better functioning thing under the Normans, and even beyond. What was formed in Norman times was enhanced, especially during the kingdom of Frederick II of Hohenstaufen, so under the Swabian period, and instead began to fall apart, if not in theory but in practice, during the late Angevin, the middle and late Angevin period, because the reasons for these peculiar characteristics actually are very complex. We can't study them now. I should have done a video. I think I ought to have done a video about it before, just to make things a bit clearer. But let's assume that we know that the Norman Kingdom of Sicily had very robust statal structures that had been promoted by the Normans and enhanced by Frederick II, and which were finally inherited by the Angevins. And this definitely exalted the kingdom's wealth, because it was a wealth that we have to intend as the result of a very efficient fiscal machine. Sicily and southern Italy were at the time, in the low medieval period, definitely quite wealthy areas on their own. But let's say that from the Norman time onwards, this wealth was progressively, invested, shaped, and distributed in a way that wasn't that was functional to the ambitions of a kingdom. And this was done through this fiscal bureaucracy, essentially, that quite managed and well managed the financial resources of the kingdom. Sicily was mostly important because it exported grain, so basically a large part, for instance, of Italy was fed through the Sicilian grain and wheat. So the whole importance of the Sicilian island and of the other peninsular and lands of the kingdom was evident. Sicily is in the middle of the Mediterranean and controls many routes. The kingdom had expanded all over the Mediterranean, in Tunisia, in the Near East, and in other islands, even in Greece. So it was a very broad thing, and this meant that this fiscal administration was crucial in, assisting the policies of the Sicilian kings. It's something that indeed highly resembles, even with all its differences, the what happened in the modern age, where progressively the sovereigns became to adjust, let's say, to reduce the power and the prerogatives of the local communities that existed, in fact, since the Middle Ages or even before, and at the benefits of a centralization. Well, this in the Sicilian kingdom had already happened, because it was the only kingdom that I know, and that is famously known for anyone who has studied the history of medieval law, for instance. It was the only kingdom in which the juridical prerogatives of the king were superior to the rights of the subjects. While in all the other kingdoms you find that the kings, like the small lords of the High Middle Ages, were put in charge by God, and every form of ideological propaganda that could be behind that, but their role in more practical and realistic terms was derived from the power that same communities gave them in order to defend them and defend their rights and prerogatives. Well, in the Kingdom of Sicily, and this is something that you will clearly see from the legislation of Frederick II of Hohenstaufen as a king of Sicily, the king had to respect the prerogatives, etc. But at least theoretically and factually, as he did, as he proved, he could go beyond that. I mean, there was a greater good embodied by the king that could go even beyond the the local human laws, and this obviously had much to do with sort of divine victory that the king had, and I don't want to go too deep into that, but just to make you understand how. And this could be implemented in practical administration. So think about the huge potential of this kingdom. Powerful, rich, well structured, with a degree of royal power that could go even beyond the local rights. And this was the case of the peak of this was under Frederick II, that made of Sicily the center of Europe at the time. In many ways, Frederick was an extraordinary figure. It's probably one of the few topics I truly fear to discuss about the Middle Ages, because Frederick was a too great character to even be described, and we, historiographically speaking, we still live in a myth about him, because we can't even figure out the historical truth, considering the huge out of charisma and other myths that have been built around him since the time since his times really well. But beyond the mystifications and all that, Frederick was also a very pragmatic king that made of Sicily, very the most powerful kingdom at the time. Indeed, maybe just the king of France had more power, but he also had, a different structures in his dominions. The king Kingdom of Sicily was important, especially under Frederick, for the broader perspectives that this king had, because he was not just a Sicilian king, but he was also the Holy Roman Emperor, and many other titles. So he was pursuing a universalistic policy that the Kingdom of France would start only from the end of the 13th and the beginning of the 14th century. And we come back to the French because it's about the Angevins that we're talking about. And as you know, the Kingdom of Sicily at a certain point is conquered by the Angevins that kick out the natural son of Frederick, that was Manfred, and eventually they even kill Conradin, that was the last Hohenstaufen, at least the last male Hohenstaufen, that basically makes marks the end of the German domination of the Kingdom of Sicily and begins to the French one. Charles of Anjou was famously the king, the first Angevin king of Sicily. He was Count of Provence, and he was famously the brother of King Louis IX of France, called the Saint. And let's say that the beginnings of the Angevin administration in Sicily were quite bright, because Charles was a hell of a king. Also his successor, especially Robert, was a great king. He was known as Robert the Wise, if I'm not wrong. And especially the Angevins had similar ambitions compared to the former owners of the kingdom, because as we've seen, they had many properties elsewhere in the Mediterranean, in Central Europe, in Greece. Charles wanted basically to conquer Constantinople, like the Swabians had done, had wished, like under Frederick I, and especially when Henry VI, his son, had married the last heiress of Norman Sicily, and the French began, however, in a slightly different position, let's say, because times had changed. I mean, you can tribute the Angevin presence in the Angevin rule in the Kingdom of Sicily as a little bit as the beginning of the end, which is probably an unfair judgment, but let's say that what happened under their rule created problems. The whole Europe was transforming. There was a lot of agitation. Let's say that the European economical system was going to recession, and especially in the midth of the 14th century, the Angevin Kingdom of Sicily faces, well, first of all, at the end of the 13th century, there had been a major amputation of their domains because Sicily had rebelled, because the Angevins were governing from Naples, not from Palermo. So Sicily rebelled and was taken by the Aragonese. But formally, both sides maintained the name of Kingdom of Sicily, because that was that recalled the ancient unitary asset of the dominion. So there were a lot of troubles, also because these were increasingly naval powers with a very fierce competition. So military expenses rose. Definitely, these subtracted probably many resources also to the inland affairs. We can say that in a certain measure, this agitation and fragmentation brought unavoidably to a sort of decline. And it was a very unbalanced situation. I mean, under the Normans and under the Swabians, the Kingdom of Sicily as an entity, in spite of all its enemies, had been much safer in its integrity than under the Angevins, that in fact lost even the island that gave the name to their kingdom. Um, and therefore this state of agitation that followed was very dramatic, because you couldn't, there was less, there was a much shorter range of strategical thinking, because factors were many, risk was higher, and this obviously brought to political instability, and this political instability brought especially arose with dynastic problems that arose in the 14th century, end of the 14th century, with the plague. Think of all the background in the meanwhile, all the context. When the Angevins split in various branches, the one of Hungary, of Epirus, that is today's Albania, of Tarantum, or Taranto, as you say in Italian, and of France, that brought to these armies coming back and forth, even not just in southern Italy, but through the whole peninsula, and a lot of problems that made the Angevin family really lose much of the power that they had had. Most of all, you can say, however, going back to what I was commenting on before, is that the Angevins probably didn't conceive their Sicilian dominions as something personal. They had gone into this enterprise of creating this Mediterranean dominion by taking Sicily with the support of the Pope, but really saw the Kingdom of Sicily not as their home, but rather as a sort of launching point, a sort of base to exploit till the core, in order to pursue a broader policy into the Mediterranean that involved other lands. And the difference probably stands also in the fact that the Angevins were tied to the French crown. So there was a system, a broad wealth system in Europe at the time, that went from the Channel up to Epirus, that was represented by these French dominion, and paradoxically the Kingdom of Sicily was just a small part for how big it was in the bigger picture. However, with these dynastic struggles, the situation collapsed, and indeed you can see that throughout all the Angevin rule, the wealth that had been used by the Normans and by the Swabians to sustain new economical experiences, for instance, of the southern Italian society, were definitely abandoned. What I mean is that the Normans that ruled from Sicily cared about the fact of having a Sicily that worked, economically speaking, that could support politically and economically the royal policy. The same goes for Frederick II. We can say that also before, when Frederick was still a minor, and his Sicilian lands that he had inherited from his father Henry VI were ruled by his German counselors. These Germans were awful indeed, and made a lot of harm to Sicily already at that time. But Frederick, when he became king, really restructured and reshaped Italy, his Italian dominions, by thinking that they were a vital part of his own politics. So he was probably a quite pragmatic person, but he was also he also grew up in the city streets of Palermo, and he probably had some attachment, and so if not Sicily, at least a broader picture that still saw Italy as the center of his own plans, of his own dreams, you would say. The Angevins instead did something very different, because first of all they were there in the name of the Pope. That was the case also of the Normans and of the Swabians, um, in part at least, but that was a much more, paradoxically, a much more ambiguous situation, because the French were allied of the Pope at that time against the Germans. Um, but probably the Angevins would have even liked to do something better in Sicily, but the Pope constantly pushed them to react to other problems, and therefore summing that with the other problems that were adding in the managing of the Sicilian lands, this didn't bring to the same mm, to that continuity that had marked, in a certain sense, this Swabian rule on the footsteps of the Norman predecessors. And all this wealth of the Kingdom of Sicily was eroded for the ambitions of a much broader policy that didn't take into consideration the welfare of the local communities. A lot of wealth definitely went to the dynasty itself, that used it to wage war against the Aragonese, against the Ghibellines, against the Germans, against the enemies, against the Byzantines. But it also supported the court and art. Let's say that the Angevins had a quite developed court. They maintained the ancient bureaucracy that had formed since the Norman times, and there is a very highly refined production of manuscripts. The Angevins did surely something structurally good. However, there were, as we said, other players. For instance, the Tuscan bankers. The Tuscan bankers, basically, especially during the dynastic struggles of Angevin Naples, call it Naples from this time onwards, since Sicily was lost to the Aragonese, basically ruled the southern Italy through their administration, because these were the same bankers that had originally financed. They came from Florence, from Siena. They were the guys who had financed the crusade that Charles of Anjou had fought on behalf of the Pope against Manfred of Sicily. And in order, since this was basically an investment, a non-repayable investment, because it was a war of destruction, these Tuscan bankers had been entrusted by the Angevins of essentially the monopoly, the cartels of many goods of the Sicilian lands, including most famously the Sicilian grain, through which Florence became rich, because basically it was Florentine bankers that made the grain coming from Sicily to Florence and then to be sold elsewhere in Italy. So I think this is also why Florence is on the rise in this period, and it becomes literally the wealthiest city in the world, because they had taken through this Sicilian way, say Sicilian mean, the monopoly over the Sicilian grain, and these Tuscan bankers at a certain point even became to rule Angevin Naples on their own. There is gossip whether even the Queen of Naples at a certain point ruled jointly to this lover of hers. It was a Tuscan merchant, and you can understand which was the the obvious profits and gains of these Tuscans that yeah, they probably had many interests as well for the wealth of the Angevin kingdom, because it was the one that was actively protecting them from the Ghibellines in central and northern Italy that were fighting against them. But they definitely, as merchantmen, businessmen, all they wanted was to make money, and probably they didn't give a damn about the Neapolitans. And there is all literature about this. Famously, Boccaccio was the one of the most prominent figures in medieval literature. He was Tuscan. He went. He was part of a group of merchants, of bankers, the Peruzzi group, that operated in Naples, and then there are a lot of novels in his Decameron that actually take place in Naples, and you can feel the distrust, the prejudices against the Neapolitans from these young Tuscan who, however, believed in merged um, in this Neapolitan society. So there was distance indeed, and we can't think of the Tuscans operating for the good of the Angevin finances, and we have to understand them as well, meaning that they probably kept them sane as long as they could, but then at a certain point the whole European economy cracked, and they had to save what they could. Many of them failed indeed, including our Boccaccio, and or at least the guys where he was associated with, and another major player in this context was the Pope. Because you might think that a king with his own dynasty has, its own business. No, because there is the Pope that considers you as his vassal. In fact, since the Norman conquest of Sicily, those lands were considered as a feudal concession that the Pope had granted to the Hauteville, in that case, on his behalf. And this is a tradition that would continue until the unification of Italy. So the Pope had a lot of ingerence into this, and he definitely shared the profit of this kingdom. But especially there were more autochthonous forces that kind of were kind of detrimental to the unity of the same Statal, Sicilian Statal organization, that were the local barons, and these are the figures that I think are more interesting in this picture, because indeed when the Angevins came into the Kingdom of Sicily, they brought with them a wholly new aristocracy that was made up of French nobility, essentially. And substituting unavoidably the pro-Swabian aristocracy that disappeared. However, in this process, you must think that were other minor entities that, however, altogether were quite strong, quite numerous at least, that were the barons. They were a class that had always existed into these lands that were otherwise quite heterogeneous, because the Kingdom of Sicily, as we've seen, had Sicily, a peninsular part of southern and central Italy, and the way the Kingdom of Sicily had been born was sort of a sum of all different domains that had very different stories. Sicily had been Arab with a strong Greek presence and an Italic substratum. Then you had inland the Byzantine holdings along the coast, and then even their Saracen influences, and then the Longobards quite strongly, that were in turn divided into various factions. I mean, it was a pretty messy. There were city-states as well that the Normans choked most famously, Amalfi, that was one of the most important maritime republics in Italy, and also the most ancient one, at least among the big ones, that decayed because the feudal assets that the Normans gave was definitely in contrast with the development of too many local freedoms, especially of such wealthy areas, such wealthy communities like a maritime republic, which was negative in part because the Normans also needed fleets at a point, and they still played a little bit with these communities before wiping them out completely. Um, and what happened when the Angevins arrived in this whole mess? It resembles this kind. You have to think that political instability is it's paradise for local powers to rise. Every time there is a big structure that crumbles, there is always some kind of parasites that eat it up, um, and try to enlarge in turn. And the local barons, that were many, because these lands of Sicily were quite densely populated considering the European standards of the time, were strengthened by these processes, also because when you have so much political instability and you have a regime changing like this, even the new guys that kick in, unless they're not overwhelmingly strong, which wasn't the case of the Angevins in spite of their success, really try to push for immediate agreements, immediate, the settlement of at least the major issues, and obviously they are more prone to grant something to these barons that are there, and they in practice hold the local power because they were the lower layer of aristocracy, but they were still powerful, and and quite well rooted into the social pattern of Sicilian society, um, and it's not surprising that these barons were entrusted by the Angevin kings of their own lordships that they had formed, maybe even recently, and with a renovated and very wide a jurisdictional and political autonomy. Indeed, if you look at the kingdom of Naples as such, but even at the kingdom of Sicily under the Aragonese, there are similarities from this point of view, although they're not really the same thing. You see that, especially the kingdom of Naples, it was larger and more built up, wasn't really something so unitary. I mean, on the surface it was, because institutionally speaking, it was king, the kingdom point, and there is a king and he rules everywhere. But there were many entities that were a bit on their own. For instance, the princedom of Taranto was quite a powerful entity well through the modern age. Even the Duchy of Calabria retained some sort of solid power, and Naples is fairly distant from them, so they even pursued autonomous politics on their own. They're very interesting entities that I would like to talk about if I had enough time. However, what you see is that great part of this really started from the bottom, from this baron class, that really pushed for a weak crown, because that was the way they could ask crown for our power and not to be particularly oppressed, not to have to pay too much for the king's requests, and all these political games that you can imagine. And that were happening, by the way, all over Europe at the time. You can argue that this was the moment in which, for instance, mafia was born. Yeah, considering, but this is an exception in the sense that no other kingdom before in European history had been so strongly centralized like the one of Sicily. So in a certain sense, these barons were making things going back to normality from the European standards of the time. Mafia is something that survived from a process of Statal formation that in the south of Italy was kind of aborted during the 18th century, while these local parastatal entities were essentially everywhere, especially during the Middle Ages. It was the norm everywhere. Um, and this, however, was definitely not good for the Angevin kingdom. And yet, evidently, these Angevin kings were obliged to share this power, also because they weren't stupid at all. The Angevins were quite clever fellows. They were quite skilled people. I think the French crown at that time was the most advanced, most powerful. These guys were in continuous contact. They knew how things worked. They weren't the latest guys arrived from nowhere. And so this tells you how powerful these barons actually were concretely. And and what is what was detrimental instead, especially from a social perspective, so from lower classes that we tend to ignore during the Middle Ages, but that especially in a region like southern Italy were fairly advanced, although not like in the center and in the north of the peninsula, but for European standards, Sicilians and Napoleons were quite wealthy and had an entrepreneurial character and ambitions, at least, that had been stemmed in fact from these very powerful dynasties, and that at this time instead get oppressed by the local barons. And in fact you see that many cities and burghs that were present in the Kingdom of Sicily were basically entrusted to the barons as thieves, and essentially this was something actually pretty sad, because many of these centers were essentially state owned. I mean, they hadn't belonged to anyone else before, if not the king. And this tells you, by the way, how the Normans and the Swabians had tried to keep things balanced, because barons existed also before, but the Normans and the Swabians had been strong enough to keep an equilibrium, a balance between the feudal lords and vassals like these barons, and these urban centers that hadn't been growing so much, but that right amount to make aristocracy being in check for some reason. Also because, as we were seeing before, urban centers allowed the Sicilian kings to have many material goods. I mean, we would build up ships. Sicily is in the middle of the sea. The Norman and Swabian policies were highly based on sea power as well, not just on land power. Urban centers have always been very good logistical centers and wealth producers, and they have markets. You can find special goods there that you can use. So instead, during the Angevin rule and the eventual crisis of the Angevin kingdom, what you have is that these centers decay. They decay, and the nobles have obviously they not only make these communities decaying, but also the public control on them decaying. So it was detrimental for lower classes as well for the kings. And in fact, what you find in here is that the only urban centers that maintained a certain prerogative were the major cities. Obviously, Naples became first of all the capital of the Angevin kingdom, from which we say Neapolitan kingdom from a certain time onwards. And but there were also other cities that regions like Apulia, for instance, were quite wealthy, and there were very big centers, markets there, and that they probably gained some recognition for that, um, um, being saved from the barons in this way. However, the major part of urban centers were choked by the barons. Um, and um, and what happened, however, is that even these bigger cities saw a decline in their political autonomy, because these cities were ruled by a royal captain, and this captain began to have an increasingly stricter control on local communities, and this highly suffered the elective offices that were instead traditionally present in these cities from centuries, and therefore, even in this process, when especially when there were dynastic crises, even these major cities didn't have the strength anymore to fight against the local feudal lords and barons, and would kind of remain kind of stuck and couldn't exploit more than much, um, and um, and had definitely much lesser freedom than the one they had had during the time of the Normans and of the Swabians. Overall, you can argue that the Kingdom of Sicily, when was definitely, the Kingdom of Naples, when it was eventually conquered by the Aragonese in the 15th century, was still a hell of a power. And well through the 18th century, you can say that the Kingdom of Sicily was one of the most powerful in Europe, at least compared to the to kingdoms of similar size that were elsewhere, because obviously in modern Europe there were greater groups that even were born out of joint unifications. Think of what the Habsburgs did, think about the Polish and the Lithuanians did. The Angevins actually at a certain point managed to unify Hungary with Naples, and that was an interesting marriage, let's say, because there were actually quite great interests in the Adriatic Sea that were common both to the Hungarians and to the Neapolitans, often against Venice, that kind of was quite individualistic at the time and didn't care, and was quite worried about what would choke the Strait of Otranto between Albania and Apulia for their trade, obviously. So I think this was a bit the story of how the institutional and statal structures evolved during this phase of transition between the Swabians and the Angevins, and it's an It's an interesting story, isn't it? I mean, now I would like to add more about it, but I realize these videos are getting too long. But what I mean is that it's very fascinating to see in perspective, you know, how certain things actually evolve, not because there is a bad guy who makes things going wrong. Here we have depicted the barons as villains substantially. I have an overall positive prejudice towards the Angevins. I mean, I don't think they were particularly bright in comparison to a mind like the one of Frederick II. We can't say that. As well as we can't say they weren't really like the Normans, but those were other times, other centuries. But overall, they did good. I mean, initially speaking, from the Kingdom of Naples, the Angevins really had a huge, powerful dominion in the Mediterranean, in Italy. In Italy, there was at a certain point an Angevin hegemony that was expressed by the Guelph party into Italy. Then until with especially with the eclipse of German imperial rule, did was managed to gain a lot of terrain. But eventually, from the time the Italian expedition of Henry VII of Luxembourg, king of the Romans and eventually Roman Emperor, crowned in Rome in a very clumsy way, but at least by name he was a Holy Roman Emperor. Things started to change again, but it passed a lot of time from the times Charles of Anjou decapitated Conradin on the market square of Naples, and then the revanche of the if we can't say of the Ghibellines and of the Germans in Italy. And it's fascinating because the Angevins were also culturally open in a way. I believe they weren't really the French stubborn guys that exported their French feudal system without considering anyone. Yeah, they were probably a bit rough under this point of view, but they were clever and they knew how to adapt. They also exported certain forms of administration that were typical of French administrative culture into Italy, not just into the Angevin kingdom, but also in Piedmont, for instance. There was a marshal, maniscalcus actually in Latin, that was sent to create a dominion into north western Italy at that time. And that was and they were especially great commanders, the great military organizers. The 13th century indeed is the century of the French cavalry in many ways, not just militarily speaking, but also politically speaking. And yet, from the top of this, of these qualities, they were still able to recognize what to do into a different environment. And yet, however, you know what the problem really was in Sicily is that um, uh, since the death of Frederick II, and even before, during all the wars that were fought against Frederick by the Pope, um, and even before Frederick, when he was still a minor and his father had prematurely died, the Sicilian kingdom had gone declining in many ways. I mean, it was still a formidable entity, very powerful, very strong, but there had been too much discontinuity from Norman times in terms of a strong, safe, steady rule that would organize and change and relocate resources, and the kind of Statal organization went declining accordingly. So at the times the Angevins arrived, there was already some kind of economical crisis kicking in, and I'm not, telling the truth, very much convinced that they were so faulty into this. Also, because objectively Sicily was the wealthiest place there in the kingdom, and they lost it. And they lost it because the Aragonese and the Byzantines and the Ghibellines did everything they could to take that away. But even that passage was risky because Aragon was on the rise indeed, but they still hadn't such a strength to go into Sicily and rule it and making everything work. And what you find in the Neapolitan kingdom of the Angevins is, with the barons, is broadly speaking what happened into Aragonese Sicily. Probably even worse. Probably even worse in Sicily than in Naples, because in Naples there was at least a bit more of continuity. The Aragonese kind of were weaker from their position, but it was also a time of continuous warfare, a naval warfare, terrestrial warfare. All the ports, like Messina, for instance, in Sicily, that were quite important, suffered. There was destructions of sieges, and those are things that really don't do good to the structure of a kingdom, and too many resources were lost to make it work. Plus, there was this dynastic rule, without which I don't know what the Neapolitan kingdom could have managed to achieve. Because effectively, you know, they were conquered by the Aragonese only in the 40s of the 15th century, so theoretically there would have been time to, you know, to gain, to do other policies that could strengthen the kingdom, but evidently there was something broken, in which a dynastic crisis, you know, wouldn't surely help. So this is all. I'm sorry, we will be coming back on this topic. I don't know if you liked it. I realized that for many people, you know, the history of the Kingdom of Sicily is something very obscure, unknown, but definitely was one of the most important chapters of medieval history. So I don't understand. I realize increasingly when I see also the views I get, the likes I get, that people tend to like things that is much more related to their national history than anything else. I mean, everything that exceeds, that goes out from, you know, the scope of that peculiar kingdom doesn't exist. Like as if Europe was a, you know, a strange abstract entity. These stories are fully European stories, because what happened in Sicily and the transformations that took place really affected Italy, they affected Spain, they affected Greece, they affected France, they affected England, they affected the Holy Roman Empire, they affected North Africa. I mean, a whole world that was really much more interconnected that we can imagine, definitely. And these were areas that had a lot of resources to use, so there was a lot of kinetic energy pouring out of them, even when disasters occurred. So if you like this video, share it. I'm asking you, because that's the best way really you can do. Otherwise, just leave a like or a comment. And if you want a personalized video on a topic at your choice, at your wish, just write me and see what I can do. And obviously, if you have questions about this video too, about the Kingdom of Sicily, about anything else, just ask. Also, because I understand that these are very big topic, and they ought to be better explained in theory, and there are a lot of things that might not be clear to an audience. Sometimes I talk about things giving for granted that you already know more or less what I'm talking about, but it's not always the case. So just please feel free to ask. So I wish you a nice time, and see you in the next video. Bye.